Napoleon's Italian campaign of 1796–97 has always provoked military historians to superlatives. His contemporaries were equally enthusiastic. In October 1797, the Directory presented the Army of Italy with an inscribed flag. This recorded that the army had taken 150,000 prisoners, 170 enemy standards, 540 cannon and howitzers, 5 pontoon trains, 9 64-gun ships of the line, 12 frigates, 18 galleys, in addition to sending to Paris masterpieces by Michelangelo, Guercino, Titian, Paolo Veronese, Correggio Albano, Raphael and the Carracci. More saliently, the army had fought 67 actions and triumphed in 18 pitched battles enumerated as follows: Montenotte, Millesimo, Mondovi, Lodi, Borghetto, Lenato, Castigliani, Roverito, Bassano, St. George, Fontana Viva, Caldero, Arcola, Rivoli, La Favorita, Tagliamento, Tarnis and Neumarkt. What enabled Napoleon to win so many battles and with such apparent ease? Did luck or military genius play the greater part? Were the revolutionary armies different in kind from the Austrian forces? Was Napoleon a tactical or strategic innovator? Was he a political visionary who used his victories to promote a pilot form of Italian federation? Or was he just a glorified pillager? And what precisely was it that made him an object of fear, envy and hatred by the Directory, who by their actions tacitly acknowledged that he was already the single most powerful man in France? There were 4 main factors that contributed to Napoleon's remarkable military success: technology, the effects of the French Revolution, the superior morale of his men, and his own genius as tactician and strategist. Overwhelming defeat in the 7 Years' War had the result that the French thereafter bent their energies to be abreast of all the latest military technology. The most encouraging results were in the field of artillery, which Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval had first begun modernizing in 1763. Lighter gun barrels and carriages made it possible to produce 1, 2 or 24-pounder calibers for field guns, which was the ordnance hitherto thought possible only for siege guns. Gribeauval's new artillery was at the technological forefront until R-825, but the revolution provided a new fillip after Valmy in 1792, which was far in advance of any battle yet fought in terms of big guns and artillery rounds fired. The war fever of 1793 saw massive production of artillery weapons, 7,000 cannon in that year alone, and the efforts of scientists like Gaspard Monge made sure that France remained at the technological cutting edge. The know-how was therefore in place, ready to be exploited by an artilleryman of high talent. No more perfect individual for this particular historical moment could be imagined than the young Bonaparte, schooled as he was in the doctrines of Dutheil and Guibert. Yet if France had the edge in big guns, its superiority in infantry firepower was marginal. Battlefield firearms were still mainly muzzle-loading, smooth-bore flintlocks, and the standard issue was the 1777 Charleville musket, a .70 caliber weapon, 50 inches long. This was virtually useless against compact bodies of troops at ranges greater than 250 yards, and even a sharpshooter needed 100 yards range or less to pick out an individual. The crudity of this weapon was the reason battlefields were often blacked out with dense clouds of smoke. Every soldier carried into battle 50 cartridges, powder charges and 3 spare flints, but the coarse black powder used by the French resulted in excessive fouling of the barrels, so that they had to be cleaned after every 50 rounds. The flint also needed to be changed after a dozen shots. Muskets misfired on average once in 6 shots, which in the heat of battle often led to soldiers double loading their weapons. The crudity of gunfire in this period needs emphasis. Reloading was a clumsy, complicated, time-consuming business. Typically, an infantryman would take a paper cartridge from his pouch and bite off the end containing the ball, which he retained in his mouth. Then he opened the pan of his musket, poured in a priming charge and closed it. Next he tipped the remainder of the powder down the barrel, spat the musket ball after it, folded the paper into a wad and then forced both ball and wad down the barrel onto the powder charge with his ramrod. Finally he took aim and fired. The mere recital shows how many things could go wrong. A soldier could double load after an unnoticed misfire, or forget to withdraw his ramrod before pulling the trigger. Most commonly, clumsy or malingering soldiers would spill most of the powder charge on the ground to avoid the mule kick of the weapons at their shoulder. When to the crudity of the musket is added generally poor marksmanship by the French, it can be readily understood why Napoleon thought artillery was the key to winning battles. Although an expert marksman could get off 5 shots a minute, the average was only 1 or 2. Slowness was compounded by inaccuracy. At a range of 225 yards, only 25% of shots could be expected to hit their target, 40% at 150 yards and only 60% even as close as 75 yards. French infantrymen were generally poor shots because musketry practice was neglected, partly to save ammunition, partly to avoid casualties from burst barrels, but most of all out of a doctrinaire conviction that killing by shot was the job of the artillery. The infantry went in to mop up with cold steel. Even so, deaths from the bayonet were few. Its impact tended to be psychological rather than actual, causing fear but not death. On the other hand, at ranges less than 50 yards, even the 1777 musket was deadly and could produce horrific casualties. When it came to individual weaponry, Napoleon laid most emphasis on the rifled carbines, lighter, smaller calibered weapons, issued to snipers, sharpshooters, skirmishers, voltigeurs and non-commissioned officers. Dense clouds of these skirmishers, in numbers sometimes amounting to regimental strength, would engage and harass the enemy while the main column approached with drawn bayonets. If the morale of the main body of attackers was low, an elite grenadier company would be placed in the rear to urge others forward. If morale was good, the elite corps would lead the right wing into battle. Napoleon planned his battles to maximize the advantages of technology and minimize the disadvantages of infantry and muskets. First, he would unleash a devastating bombardment from his big guns to inflict heavy losses and lower resistance. While this barrage was going on, snipers and voltigeurs used the cover to advance within musketry range in hopes of picking off officers and spreading confusion. The next stage was a series of carefully coordinated cavalry and infantry assaults. The cavalry would attempt to brush aside the enemy's horse and then force his infantry to form square. French infantry then moved up to close quarters to prevent the enemy in square from reforming in line. The square was usually proof against cavalry charges, but it left those forming it highly vulnerable to an infantry attack, since men drawn up in a square or rectangular formation could fire only in a limited number of directions, enabling the advancing French columns to come to close quarters without sustaining the withering fire and unacceptable casualties normal when engaging an enemy drawn up in line. The final stage came when the infantry forced a gap in the enemy lines. Horse artillery would widen the breach, and then French cavalry would sweep forward for the breakthrough. Time and again the Austrian method of relying on infantry unprotected by cover or cavalry screens played into Napoleon's hands, and proved useless against the combination of massed artillery and highly trained sharpshooters. Objectively, then, the French army of Italy, though outnumbered, disposed of superior technology which a commander of high talents could use to open up a decisive gap. Yet Napoleon was unimaginative when it came to the exploration of new technologies. He showed no interest in the use of military observation balloons, even though he had been formed in a revolutionary culture where Danton's balloon flight was a central image. Nor did he show any interest in inventions which had the potential for producing a military quantum leap, such as Fulton's submarine and steamboat. This is puzzling, since Napoleon prided himself on his interest in science, and was closely associated with scientists like Monge, Laplace and Chaptal. Some historians have argued that Napoleon sensed the contemporary limitations of technology, and it is true that the technical breakthrough in metallurgy which would usher in railways, the steamship and the breech-loading rifle, was a post-rate RS phenomenon. The second great advantage Napoleon had in the Italian campaign was that he had a relatively homogeneous army infused with the spirit of the revolution, whereas the Austrian army was polyglot, stymied by paperwork and excessive bureaucracy, and still enthralled to the frozen hierarchies of the ancient regime. The revolution made possible new tactics and organization, provided fresh pools of manpower and talent, and provided a citizen army with positive ideals, images and ideologies. It is not necessary to go all the way with the theorists Clausewitz and Georges Sorel and claim that a citizen army was a sufficient explanation for Napoleon's success in Italy, but it was a necessary one. Military service by citizens who genuinely felt they were participating in a state enterprise of which they approved produced a highly motivated force of what Sorel called intelligent bayonets. The revolution, with its career open to talents, produced for a while a meritocratic gap, especially in the army, through which proceeded highly talented men who would have been born to blush unseen under the ancient regime. Without the revolution, Napoleon himself could not have had his meteoric rise, nor would he have had Lannes, Murat, Devout, Massena, Augereau and his other favorite generals at his side. While 100 flowers bloomed in France, their enemies remained petrified in the social immobility of the old regime. Napoleon's dictum, that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack, was anachronistic by the time he uttered it, when most of the avenues for advancement had already been choked off, but it still had meaning during the Directory. However, there was considerable irony in that Napoleon himself discounted this factor, except for propaganda purposes, and quickly moved to replace a revolutionary ethos with a purely military one. Esprit de corps replaced civic virtue and patriotic virtue as the ideological cement in Napoleon's army. By the imperial period the process was complete, but Napoleon's army of 1796-97 was already very far from the citizen army raised by Levy en masse in 1793-94. One obvious pointer is that the lust for booty replaced zeal to export the revolution. This involves the question of morale and how Napoleon was able to bind the troops to him, so that they were prepared to endure amazing hardships on his behalf. The discipline of his army needs stressing, since to switch from column to line, as in the order mixed which Napoleon used in Italy, required precise coordination if the result was not to be a shambles. In theory it was all straightforward, the line provided superior firepower, and the column superior mobility, weight and shock. Napoleon's instructions sounded simple, but they were always based on the ability of highly trained units to implement them. Napoleon's military maxims presuppose an army keyed to the highest pitch of elan and commitment. What sounds like armchair theorizing turns out on closer inspection to require every single army corps to be an elite unit. Take the following: when you are driven from a first position, you should rally your columns at a sufficient distance in the rear to prevent the enemy from anticipating them, for the greatest misfortune you can meet with is to have your columns separately attacked before their junction. What is merely implicit in that prescription becomes explicit with this: an army should be ready every day and at all hours to fight. An army ought always to be ready by day, by night, and at all hours, to make all the resistance it is capable of making. To get entire army corps committed to his principles, Napoleon had to win hearts and minds. This he was able to do for a number of reasons. For a start, he had a track record of almost continual onwards and upwards triumph over his enemies. Nothing succeeds like success, and morale increased almost geometrically at the thought of being part of an ever-victorious army. Napoleon headed off the possible sources of his troops' discontent. He clothed and equipped them well, paid them in specie, and turned a blind eye to their pillaging expeditions. Victory in battle was not just the largely meaningless prelude to diplomacy it had been under the ancient regime. To win a battle now meant there was a serious chance of riches, yet the brilliance of Napoleon lay in his understanding of human psychology. He realized that at root human beings are driven by money, but that they hate to admit this is what actually motivates them and are therefore grateful to leaders who can mystify and obfuscate the quest for filthy lucre. The best possible scenario is that of the conquistadors, where the quest for riches could be rationalized as the desire to serve God. Napoleon could not use religion in this way, but he spoke of glory, immortality, the judgment of posterity, hence the swords of honor and, eventually, the institution of the Legion of Honor. A man does not have himself killed for a few halfpence a day or for a petty distinction. You must speak to the soul in order to electrify the soul. On the Italian campaign, Napoleon really learned human psychology. He realized that men like to be rewarded in their pockets while being appealed to in their minds and hearts. This was why, many years later, when he came to establish the Marshallate, he took great care to combine the most elaborate titles, duchies, princedoms, and even thrones with the most elaborate emoluments of benefices. And that was why, while conniving at the looting of his old sweats, he liked to flatter and cajole them. With his amazing memory for detail, he could remember the names of obscure rankers and make them feel 10 feet tall by an appreciative word. The men actually liked his habit of tweaking their ears in parades, for this was a general who could deliver on his promises. For such a man, who rewarded them, understood them, and even remembered their names, the troops could not do too much. Some of his victories were possible only because of a highly committed army, at the peak of morale. During the Rivoli campaign, Massina's division fought at Verona on 1-3 January, marched all night to reach Rivoli early on the 14th, fought all day against the Austrians, marched all night and all day on the 1/5 towards Mantua, and completed their epic of endurance with a battle at La Favorita on the 1/6. In 120 hours they had fought 3 battles and marched 54 miles. Yet above all, credit for the triumph in the Italian campaign must go to Napoleon's own superb talents as strategist, tactician, and military thinker. Napoleon liked to avoid frontal attacks, which were costly in lives and rarely yielded a clear-cut result, in favor of enveloping attack on the flanks. It is by turning the enemy, by attacking his flanks, that battles are won, was a favorite saying. The enveloping type of battle partly broke down the age-old distinction between strategy and tactics, for it was planned well in advance yet adapted to circumstance. The key to Napoleon's success and his favorite battle plan was his reorganization of the army into a corps system. Each corps became in effect a miniature army, each with its own cavalry and artillery arm, and each capable of operating independently for 48 hours or more. At the limit, it had to be capable of taking on an enemy force 3 times its size. When contact was made with hostile forces, Napoleon ordered the corps nearest the enemy to pin him down, often encouraging an all-out assault from the opposition by the very paucity of its own numbers. Meanwhile, the rest of the army would be engaged in forced marches to fall on the enemy flanks and rear at a predetermined moment. Perfect timing and coordination were necessary to achieve outright victory by this method, and tremendous courage and stamina on the part of the pinning corps, which was sure to take heavy losses. Even if the enemy managed to punch through the pin, it could find itself cut off from its base or in hostile territory. Usually, however, the pinning corps would not have to stand and fight for 24 hours, since Napoleon arranged for his various corps to arrive at the battle at different times. The enemy would find to his consternation that he was fighting more and more Frenchmen, and would then commit his reserves to achieve victory before further French reinforcements arrived on the scene. Meanwhile, hidden by a cavalry screen, the main enveloping force would move towards the weak spot on the flanks or rear. Napoleon always tried to envelop the enemy flank nearest his natural line of retreat, but was aware that this required meticulous timing. The favorable opportunity must be seized, for fortune is female. If you balk her today, you must not expect to meet with her again tomorrow. This was why the command of the final enveloping force was always given to his most trusted general, for everything depended on arriving at exactly the right place and time. What this meant in practical terms was that Napoleon had to work out through the smoke of battle exactly when the enemy commander committed his final reserves. The commander of the enveloping force had to keep his troops like greyhounds on the leash, lest a premature attack betray their presence. The signal to the envelopers to make their presence felt would either be a pre-arranged barrage from certain guns or, if geography permitted it, a message from an aide. The coup de grace was meant to be a combined offensive from front and rear. When the enveloping force appeared, the enemy commander would either have to weaken his front to meet the new challenge at the very moment Napoleon was launching a frontal attack, or he could opt for retreat, supremely perilous in the teeth of attacking forces. Napoleon liked to launch his final frontal attack at the hinge of the enemy's weakened front so as to cut his army in two. This aspect of military tactics appealed to Napoleon the mathematician. He liked to time his battles with a watch and showed uncharacteristic patience while he waited for events to unfold. As he put it, there is a moment in engagements when the least maneuver is decisive and gives victory. It is the one drop of water which makes the vessel run over. He also liked the chess-playing aspects of varying cavalry and infantry attacks. In the final assault, a cavalry charge would make the enemy form square, thus making the advancing infantry columns less vulnerable. When once a hole was made in the enemy line, his forces would quickly fall into disarray. In the final stage of exploitation of a victory, the cavalry came into its own, aiming to turn defeat into rout by relentless pursuit. However, it was not always possible, for geographical and logistical reasons, or because the enemy anticipated the move, for Napoleon to employ his favorite enveloping strategy. In such a case, he liked to take up the central position, interposing his forces between two parts of the enemy army so as to destroy it piecemeal. Overwhelming the enemy in detail was particularly suited to a situation where the battlefield itself was divided by a hill, river, or some other natural feature. Time and again Napoleon defeated overall superior numbers by gaining local numerical superiority. He had a genius for finding the hinge or joint between two or sometimes even three different enemy armies. He would then concentrate his forces, crash through the hinge and interpose himself between two armies, forced apart, and thus, in technical language, operating on exterior lines, the enemy would be at a natural disadvantage. Having selected which enemy force he would deal with first, Napoleon deployed 2/3 of his forces against the chosen victim while the other third pinned the other enemy army, usually launching assaults that looked like the prelude to a full-scale attack. After defeating the first army, Napoleon would detach half his victorious host to deal with the second enemy army, while the rest of his victorious troops pursued the remnants of the vanquished force. There were two snags to this strategy. The obvious one was that, since Napoleon himself could not be in two places at once, it was likely that a less skilled general would botch the operation Bonaparte was not supervising personally. The other, more serious, problem was intrinsic to the strategy itself, because he needed to divert half his victorious force to deal with the second enemy army. He did not have the resources to follow up the vanquished foe and score a truly decisive victory. For this reason, the central position as a strategy was always a second best to the golden dream of canny-style envelopment. From the Italian campaign evolved certain military principles that Napoleon never altered. These may be summed up as follows. The army's lines of communication must always be kept open. The army must have a clear primary objective with no secondary distractions. The enemy army, not his capital or fortified towns, must always be the objective. Always attack, never remain on the defensive. Always remember the importance of artillery so that ideally you go into battle with 4 big guns for every 1,000 men. The moral factor is to the material as 3 is to 1. Above all, Napoleon emphasized the importance of concentration of force, speed, and the factor of time, and the cardinal principle of outflanking. Each of these ideas fed into each other. Speed of response would demoralize the enemy even as it allowed for concentration of force. A favorite Napoleonic ploy was to disperse in order to tempt the enemy into counter-dispersal, followed immediately by a rapid concertina-like concentration that caught the enemy still strung out. Speed was the single key to successful strategy, and called for careful research and preselection of the shortest practicable routes. As Napoleon wrote, strategy is the art of making use of time and space. Space we can recover, time never. Once contact was made with the enemy, concentration on the flanks was crucial. The army should always strive to turn the enemy's most exposed flank. This meant either total envelopment with a large force or an outflanking movement by corps operating apart from the main army. Napoleon's military genius is hard to pin down, but certain categories help to elucidate it. He was a painstaking, mathematical planner, a master of deception, a supremely talented improviser. He had an amazing spatial and geographical imagination, and he had a phenomenal memory for facts and minute detail. He believed in meticulous planning and wargaming, aiming to incorporate the element of chance as far as possible. By logic and probability, he could eliminate most of the enemy's options and work out exactly where he was likely to offer battle. By carefully calculating the odds, he knew the likely outcome of his own moves and his opponents'. His superb natural intelligence and encyclopedic memory allowed him to anticipate most possible outcomes and conceivable military permutations days, months, even years in advance. Madame de Remusat quotes what is surely an authentic observation: military science consists in calculating all the chances accurately in the first place, and then in giving accident exactly, almost mathematically, its place in one's calculations. It is upon this point that one must not deceive oneself, and yet a decimal more or less may change all. Now this apportioning of accident and science cannot get into any head except that of a genius. Accident, hazard, chance, call it what you may, a mystery to ordinary minds, becomes a reality to superior men. Napoleon was also a prince among deceivers, who placed fundamental reliance on his network of spies, agents and informers. It was a central part of his methods that when he made contact with the enemy, he would immediately seek to mislead their spies as to his real numbers, adding a division here, a brigade there at the very last moment, and using a thick cavalry screen to hide the concentration of infantry. His highly fluid corps system gave him flexibility in drawing up his battle lines, which was always designed to bamboozle the enemy. He liked to deploy along very wide fronts, sometimes more than 100 kilometers, so that his opponents could never know exactly where he was going to mass for the vital blow. In order to cover all of his presumed options, the opposing general was likely to disperse his forces, with fatal results. The front tended to narrow as his prey was spotted, but, to prevent anticipation, Napoleon would often narrow the front and then widen it again to keep the enemy guessing. A favorite ploy was to station his forces 2 days' march away from the enemy on, say, a Sunday, leaving the enemy to conclude that battle would be joined on a Tuesday. The French army would then stage a night march and catch their opponents unawares on Monday. But if things went wrong, Napoleon was usually equal to the occasion, as he was a superb improviser. One of his maxims was that you should always be able to answer the question, if the enemy appears unexpectedly on my right or on my left, what should I do? Naturally, improvisation was made easier by the previous mathematical calculation of all chances, no matter how far-fetched. It was, for example, essential for a commander always to have at his disposal at any given moment both an infantry and a cavalry arm, and the worst perils could be anticipated by never having more than one line of operations, and never linking columns in sight of or close to the enemy. No detachment should be made on the eve of the day of attack, because the state of affairs may alter during the night, either by means of the enemy's movements in retreat, or the arrival of great reinforcements, which may place him in a situation to assume an offensive attitude, and to turn the premature dispositions you have made to your own destruction. Napoleon additionally possessed an almost preternatural eye for ground and battlefield terrain, including a minute awareness of the strengths and weaknesses of every possible vantage point. From looking at a relief map, he could visualize all the details of a potential battlefield, and work out how an enemy was likely to deploy on the ground. He particularly liked maneuvering an opponent onto ground where geographical features like mountains and rivers told against an overall enemy numerical superiority. His frequent use of the center position was possible only because of his eye for landscape. He also liked to conceal part of his forces behind natural topographical features, such as woods or hills, and then unleash them to the surprise and consternation of the enemy. However, for all his military genius, Napoleon was never a commander in the same league as Alexander, Hannibal, or Tamerlane. His chess-playing qualities were never absolute, for an imp of the perverse manifested itself in a deliberate decision to leave certain things to chance, almost as if he were testing his own abilities at the limit or superstitiously pushing his luck to see how far it would run, side by side with his mathematical propensity went a certain empirical pragmatism, summed up in the following statement: tactics, evolution, and the sciences of the engineer and the artillery officer may be learned from treatises, much as in the same way as geometry, but the knowledge of the higher branches of the art of war is only to be gained by experience and by studying the history of man and battles of great leaders. Can one learn in a grammar to compose a book of the Iliad, or one of Corneille's tragedies? Napoleon's military talents were essentially practical rather than theoretical. It has been suggested that he never put his ideas on strategy and tactics on paper so as to keep his generals in the dark, but the truth is that he was not much of an innovator anyway. Initially, he got most of his ideas from books and did not change his approach very much. Napoleon himself made no great claims as a military theoretician. "I have fought 60 battles and I have learned nothing which I did not know at the beginning" is a statement that has sometimes raised eyebrows, But, self-mocking cynicism aside, he was being starkly realistic. The obvious snag was that his enemies would learn his methods and devise countermeasures. From a military point of view, two propositions about the Italian campaign seem warranted. His great skill notwithstanding, Napoleon was lucky. He did not have to build a military machine from scratch, inherited a potentially excellent army, and then fought in different generals. He took many gambles at long odds, notably at Arcola, where the French army could and should have been trapped in the swamps. The men he faced, Beaulieu, Wormser and Alvinzi, did not have his burning will to win. They were 18th-century generals, essentially amateurs ranged against a professional. But the element of luck can be stretched too far to explain the Bonapartist triumph. Napoleon's willpower should not be discounted as a factor in his success. He never abandoned the tactical offensive for a single day, and devoted fiendish energy to bringing the greatest possible number of men onto the battlefield by unremitting mobility and surprise. Time and again he contrived to defeat the Austrians in detail. There were other factors in Italy that produced the result where Napoleon, mistakenly, thought it was his destiny always to be fortune's darling. The plethora of talent unleashed by the revolutionary meritocracy and the short-lived period of social mobility played to Napoleon's strength. So too did his idea that the army should live off the land. His army never carried more than 3 days' supplies, while the Austrians always carried 9. The sheer size of the armies of 1793–96, making it impossible for any conventional commissariat to supply them, forced them to live off the land, even if the Directory had been able to pay for the campaign in Italy instead of being bankrupt. Long-term, the seizures, requisitioning and plundering by Napoleon's armies would provoke a terrible civilian backlash, where hideous atrocities became the norm. Again, Napoleon was lucky in 1796–97 in that he did not elicit this reaction from the Italians. The second caveat one must enter about the Italian campaign is that Napoleon did not manage to carry out his own prescriptions. He neither destroyed the enemy's armies nor sapped his will to resist further. Partly this was because of the obsession with Mantua, again in defiance of his own principles. In 1796–97 he wavered between making the siege of Mantua his supreme objective and searching out and destroying the enemy armies. Nor did he break the Austrians' will, for they resumed the military struggle in Italy in 1800. There are many who hold, with Stendhal, that the Italian campaign was Napoleon's finest achievement and that with the occupation of Venice the greatest chapter of his life came to an end. Yet no account of Napoleon in Italy is complete without a discussion of the massive sums in cash in kind he expropriated from the conquered territories. Napoleon, it is true, was under orders from the Directory to make the war pay for itself, and to remit any surplus obtained to Paris. One of the reasons the directors connived at his frequent defiance of them was the multimillion franc sweeteners he sent them. But he went far beyond this and extracted the kind of surplus from Italy for which the only proper word is exploitation. He turned a blind eye to the peculations and embezzlements of notorious money grubbers like Augereau and Messina, provided he got his cut from them. An authentic story from Hamelin about some confiscated mines shows how the Bonapartist system worked. Napoleon himself received 1,000,000 francs and his henchmen in the affair proportionate sums. Berthier got Roux, 000 francs, Muret so, 000, Bernadotte so, 000. Napoleon's hagiographers point to his stern treatment of Salisti and Guerau for their defalcations, but this misses the point. His intention was to discredit the political commissioners, so that he was no longer subject to effective control. The looting of Italy's art treasures was a particularly nefarious aspect of Napoleon's triumph. All conquered peoples or those who signed treaties with Bonaparte had to pay an indemnity in the form of precious paintings, sculptures and other works of art. The Duke of Parma was forced to disgorge Correggio's Dawn, the Pope was mulcted of 100 paintings, statues and vases, Venice yielded up some of its most priceless old masters, and everywhere the pattern was the same. Works by Giorgione, Mantegna, Raphael, Leonardo, Fra Filippo Lippi, Andrea del Sarto and many others were removed to France, either as official prizes of war or as objects of private rapine by Augereau, Messina and others. Napoleon's defenders claimed that he was under orders from the Directory to repatriate these works of arts, that it was standard revolutionary practice to confiscate the artifacts of a corrupt aristocracy. Carnot's instructions to this effect on the 7th of May 1796 are often cited, ordering Napoleon to send back works of art in order to strengthen and embellish the reign of liberty. But Napoleon and his generals did not just send back money and art treasures, they kept the majority of the loot for themselves. One estimate is that only 1/5 of the surplus in money and art extracted from Italy found its way to the Directory. Of the 50 million francs uplifted, the most conservative estimate is that Napoleon kept back 3 millions for himself. Tens of millions remain unaccounted for, and the obvious inference is that Napoleon, his family, his favorites and his generals lined their pockets to an astonishing degree. Napoleon always considered that the best way to bind the talented but ambitious generals to his cause was to associate himself with the idea of unlimited wealth. any commander following the Bonaparte star would end up with the wealth of Croesus. Napoleon claimed, absurdly, that he himself brought nothing back from Italy but his soldiers' pay, and has even found biographers and historians prepared to swallow this transparent lie. Circumstantial evidence alone is overwhelmingly against him. Napoleon connived with his brother Joseph to have a vast quantity of treasure extracted from Rome, with which Joseph built a palatial house in Paris not too far from the Rue de Victoire. Joseph pretended he had bought the property with his wife's money, though everyone knew the Claries did not have money on that scale. The rest of the Bonapartes received substantial handouts. Letizia received enough to rebuild and refurbish the family home in Ajaccio. Caroline and Jerome were sent to expensive schools, and Pauline and Elissa received lavish dowries. On his own account, Napoleon purchased the house in the Rue de la Victoire which he had previously rented, acquired a large estate in Belgium, and, when he was in Egypt in 1798, had Joseph buy a vast country house with 300 acres of parkland for Josephine at Malmaison on the banks of the Seine, just 6 miles west of Paris, at a price of 335,000 francs. Napoleon used Joseph as the family banker. Only his elder brother knew all the secret accounts where the treasure looted from Italy was stored. Napoleon's apologists also liked to divert attention to his experiments with Italian republicanism, but here the record is less clear than it needs to be to sustain the case for Bonaparte as revolutionary liberator. Officially, Napoleon was supposed to be exporting the values and ideals of the revolution to Italy as well as looting it, but the Directory was always ambivalent about the political side of the program. Their only true ideological aim was a desire to humble the Pope, but thereafter the project to republicanize Italy scarcely interested them, if only because it would make it more difficult to exchange the conquered territories with Austria. Napoleon was under strict instructions to make no binding promises to the Italians that could in any way impede a cut-and-run peace with the Austrians if the military campaign went wrong. However, Napoleon had ideas of his own. His army needed to be supplied, its communications required safeguarding, and its situation was potentially perilous, between hostile armies and sullen and superficially subdued Italian city-states. Napoleon had to carry out the difficult balancing act of encouraging the pro-French party without provoking a backlash from the conservative, aristocratic and pro-Austrian factions. To his mind, the best way to find equilibrium was to co-opt the conquered Italians in a new scheme for Italian federation. It would be time enough to dwell on the ultimate reality of the plan when military victory in Italy was secure. He began in May 1, 796 by abolishing the Austrian machinery of government in Lombardy and enacting a new constitution, with a Congress of State and municipal councils under the direction of French military governors. Milan is very eager for liberty, he wrote to the Directory. There is a club of 800 members, all businessmen or lawyers.